Hi, you're watching Talking Sense. I'm your host, Alistair Milroy. Today I've got a very special guest, someone I've known from working in Guernsey over the last 10 years, Perrin Carey of CoSteer. Welcome, Perrin. How are you today?
Hi, Alistair. It's lovely to be here. So lovely to see you. I have vague memories of us meeting outside Cafe Coco, probably nearly a year ago now, was it? We sat there and had a sunny coffee in Guernsey. So lovely to see you again, albeit remotely.
Yeah, we did, because you're dialing in from a long way away today in the subcontinent, which
I
is
am.
incredible, really, isn't it? The way our lives have changed in the last few
This
years.
is the world we now live in, isn't it? And I think there are certainly some good things and some amazing things about it, but then there's some challenges that we all face, I think, as humans, which I think we might touch on as part of our sort of discussion later. But yes, Bangalore is where I am at the moment. Just been up to New Delhi, where it was nearly 45 degrees centigrade. Come back to a rather temperate Bangalore at 32.
Yeah, and a bit more tropical in Bangalore, I mentioned, in Delhi, where it's definitely a dry heat.
Very dry in New Delhi, but we've had rain here in Bangalore, extremely refreshing. So yes, absolutely, lovely to see you, and lovely to be on the show.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, let's start from talking about your story, because you're now in fintech, but that's not where you started. So perhaps tell us a little bit about where that came from and how you got to where you are today.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm often asked, how I found my way into the kind of fintech business, and I would actually probably describe myself, if anyone asked me, as an educator, a teacher, really, a lowly teacher, as my father would probably describe me. Perrin never made it much; he just became a teacher. But actually, I think that's probably what a lot of us do in the spaces that we're in. Education is key to developing others, developing ourselves. Learning is continuous. So that's probably how I describe myself. So yes, I've had a varied career, if one thinks that careers exist anymore. University lecturer, researcher in the biochemical and psychological sciences. International education, teaching secondary education, and then spent sort of 17 years in the world of governance, risk and compliance, which is kind of, I guess, tangentially where we're going to touch on today from a tech perspective. So yeah, about 17 years in compliance, which I know is quite topical in your industry at this moment.
Very. I mean, the situation with Russia and Ukraine has, I think, brought that to the forefront. I think certainly on the corporate service provider side, compliance and AML regulations been with us for some time, but that's really come to life, I guess, as we've seen yachts. In particular, I think it'd be probably one of the higher profile assets that have been seized. I think there's a lot of property being seized or frozen, but that seems to have been much quieter. It can be done off the scene when the Italian fiscal police turn up on a 50 or 80 meter or 120 meter yacht. Or the same in France or Spain. It's straight into the press. So yeah, I think that's brought the yachting industry really having to think about who their clients are and in a lot more detail than and on the front line of management, where the fund's coming to pay for the crew salaries and the fuel and all the provisioning than has been the case in the past. And I'm sure there's lots of very busy compliance professionals working, with various businesses at the moment to see their exposure. Yeah, so
it's a booming industry, if one can call it an industry. Obviously, most organizations would consider compliance and or indeed risk management from a financial crime perspective to be simply a cost to the business. And obviously, your industry is now beginning to see the impact of that cost as a consequence of obviously the conflict. I think it's really fascinating, isn't it, that Financial crime or prevention of, let's say, really came to the fore in the very late 1990s, with various proceeds of crime acts being enforced around the world. And the Financial Action Task Force, which most people will refer to as FATF, which is the kind of global governing body on prevention of financial crime and terrorist financing. It's grown and grown since those early days. I was actually working for the Guernsey regulator, the Guernsey Financial Services Commission, at the point that they brought in these regulations in the late 90s. And then it was guidance and it was, you can do this kind of if you want to, but we would like to see you, carrying out some sort of verification checks, etc., etc. And nowadays, of course, organizations have books of compliance manuals and policies and procedures and controls and frameworks and committees in order to, function. And I think the reality is that that's suffocating so many businesses, and organizations are trying to explore different avenues of what compliance really looks like, what it is or isn't, and how to bring about a more effective compliance kind of regime, if one wants to put it like that, that doesn't necessarily involve these huge dossiers of policies, procedures, and controls. And I think this is some of the work that I've been doing over the last, I guess, probably about 5 years. But in terms of, the development work of what CoSteer now has, probably about 3 years.
Yeah, because that's really important. I saw this in my 16 or 17 years working in the Guernsey financial industry. There's firms trying to catch up with the various iterations of the handbook, putting processes in place, often perhaps didn't have the data, was stored in various different systems. So a lot of that in manual forms and trying to do sanction checks on all the people that you might be dealing with in your CRM or your client administration database becomes really unwieldy. And I think a lot of firms are still trying to make that leap to really being able to automate some of that and have data in a way that they can actually, I guess, have data they can rely on in terms of telling them what the risk is in their book and being able to interpret that, rather than simply having lots of forms flying around and having compliance officers trying to check them manually, which it's very costly and it's for business. I think we've seen that with the large banks. And I'm seeing recently some calls about how actually effective it's been in terms of, and what measurement is being done in terms of, has all this additional work and regulation and legislation actually achieved the aim of reducing financial crime?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think we were talking just before we started recording, and we were talking about some figures that were being released, that of the money that's essentially, the proceeds of financial crime floating around the world, less than 1% of that is in fact being recovered, by, regulators and financial crime enforcement agencies around the world. And of course, that's an incredibly low percentage of the amount. And then, of course, you have to then take into account the costs, as we were talking earlier, the costs that businesses are now undertaking in order to meet the requirements of the regulations that are coming out from regulators all around the world. And once you start adding those two things together, the amount that's being recovered is almost insignificant. So one has to really begin to question as to whether or not these frameworks, these regulatory requirements, and then the sort of policies, procedures, etc., that organizations put in place in order to respond to that, whether they're actually the most effective way of managing this issue. And I think this is something that's weighed on my mind for a number of years, having obviously worked in this industry for nearly 2 decades. And I think what I've come to the conclusion is that every single organization on the planet is simply a group of human beings. And what legislation is trying to do, what regulations are trying to do, is steer human behavior and human decision making. And legislation and regulation merely responds to the culture in which we exist in. If we didn't see, for example, people, sadly being killed by other people, we wouldn't have laws to prevent murder. But the reason we have laws is because human behavior steps outside of acceptable cultural frameworks, and therefore legislation comes along and tries to squeeze us back in. And this is somewhat what financial crime frameworks have been designed to do. And of course, legislation is always catching up with current culture. So what's interesting from my perspective is, well, what if we actually took the mantle and said, well, let's steer culture rather than let's try and manipulate after the fact. So this is the large work that CoSteer has been doing. We've been looking at the interconnection essentially between the culture that exists within a group of humans, so every organization, and how that culture influences the decision making and the behaviors, and essentially how effectively we put our procedures, our operational procedures into action. What we call operational or organizational murmuration. Do you know murmuration? Have you heard of murmuration?
I've seen lots of murmuration from you, Perrin. So it comes from the movement of migration of birds. Yep.
Absolutely. So, the beautiful spectacle especially in England or even in the US, of an evening when we see starlings, up in the sky in the horizon, and they form these incredible patterns in the sky. And I, as a biological scientist, I was quite interested in how this happened and how it worked. And what we've done at CoSteer is we've taken some of the sort of evolutionary psychology that sits behind murmuration of starlings. We've looked at how organizations operate as human beings with human behavior, and we've integrated them. So what we can now do is using some a cleverly designed survey instrument and some very, very clever mathematics. What we've actually constructed as a way of measuring how well an organization is murmurating. And actually, therefore, how well they're actually complying, for example, with corporate governance codes around the world. And we can give some really useful insights to an organization, for example, on their agility, their cohesion, the collaboration that's going on inside their organization. And it's all done from a scientific perspective of looking at human behavior and psychology and connecting that with essentially the need to be able to form both an individual and as an organization in an open market. So yeah, it's been a fascinating journey from compliance into tech.
It's really interesting and around the whole regulatory space, because we've, anyone who's worked in trust funds or this sort of regulated environment over the last 15 years, I mean, we've seen companies, and particularly in places like Guernsey and other jurisdictions, the Crown dependencies generally, there's been a lot more fines and public statements come out. There's been, and that creates as humans, we all go, we've got mortgages, we've got families. It does create fear, and you see that. I've certainly experienced that fear within organisations of, gosh, we don't want that to happen to us, and that drives the behaviour and not in a positive way. It's really interesting, transferring this to yachting. It's in a yacht, on any yacht, it's you've got people who are living very closely together, working very closely together, often long hours, particularly when you've got guests and you're chartering. Quite a high stress and an unnatural environment in terms of you don't get to step away. When you're working in a normal career, you get to walk away from that. And I think it's really interesting for both management organizations and yachts themselves is to be able to measure perhaps what's going on in the team, and then what those drivers are that you can use to, if we do this, how will that impact productivity? I mean, mental, and I'm going into the whole, whether it's mental health on board, which is a big topic, trying to retain crew because, there's the industry's seen a boom. So we're looking at needing a lot more crew. And then that leads you to say, how do we stop this leakage of people leaving the industry because, they need a change in lifestyle. So is that something that you can measure with the technology that you're building?
Yeah, you've touched on so many things. I don't even know where to begin. But let me touch on the thing that you just finished with, which was obviously, the challenges that all industry, but clearly your industry is facing in terms of retaining crew and ensuring the well-being of that crew. And obviously those two things are inextricably connected. That if you're creating an environment, a culture where the well-being of your crew is seen as important, and there's manifested evidence of that importance, then you're going to reduce your crew turnover. So yeah, one of the things that what we're doing is we're making a connection. We're drawing a scientific understood connection between the culture that exists within an organization, so within a crew set, and also, what effects does that have on things like the performance of that crew, the retainment of the staff, all of these types of aspects. So absolutely. So when we survey organizations and they go through the process, we collect essentially the data from the people, and then we also collect various organization statistics, sort of demographics, financial performance, and what we call human performance indicators, like staff turnover. So I can give you a quick case study. We were working with a law firm within Wellbeing, and essentially what we did was an initial assessment, and they identified 3 factors that they needed to work on, bearing in mind that we measure 27, but we were able to identify the most important and influential factors for that organization. They went away and they worked on those factors for about 3 to 6 months. And we were brought in back to measure again, obviously as part of the continuity. We actually saw an uplift in every single indicator of culture, of quality of decision making, and of quality of the implementation of those decisions. So although we were only working on 3 facets of the 27, because we know those things are all interconnected, and because we have a scientific understanding of how they're interconnected, we could steer that organization to very strategically focus their financial resources on where to spend their money to get the maximum uplift. And they saw literally a 10% rise in all of the indices that we measure. And we're beginning now to see, because obviously, organizational performance will always lag behind these changes. But we're now beginning to see an uplift in some of those organizational performances. So that organization had seen quite a high level of staff turnover. So people have been leaving. And actually, since they implemented some of these strategies, not a single person has left. And in fact, they've had 3 people join.
So they've had a lot more engagement with their team members.
Absolutely.
And I guess, ultimately, we're all in business, and where me as an accountant, and accountants love is it actually sees an improvement in the performance of the organization financially as well. This isn't just this leads on to actually the health and well-being financially of the organizations we're talking about.
Absolutely. And we like to see organizations as organic. They are truly organic, and they need to be flexible and adaptable because the environment around them is changing constantly. The pandemic over the last 2 years, the recent conflict, other effects of around the world in terms of poverty and climate change, and the impact on food being moved around the world. These things are having huge impacts on us as humans, both in terms of our mental and our physical health. And I think leaders within organizations are now having to really recognize that they have a responsibility that goes far beyond their shareholders, which obviously, has been in existence probably, for near on 70 years, the shareholder primacy model of business, that is absolutely evaporating. And I think, businesses are really having to look at, and I don't necessarily like the word, but people understand the word of looking beyond shareholders to all stakeholders, across them. And that brings the concept of the E of the environment, looking environmentally and sustainably to the earth, to look at the S of social, how is our business interacting socially with the world? And I don't just mean CSR. I'm talking about the human beings in your organization, their family, their friends, so if you've got a team of 50 in your organization, you're actually having an influence. Your culture in your organization will have an influence on probably 400 people, because it's them and their families and maybe their children. And, so the way that they're being treated and their health and work is having an effect on far beyond. And then the G of ESG, of course, which is this word that no one really understands, which is governance, which is what we're trying to essentially humanize. So we don't talk about governance anymore. We talk about human governance, bringing the humanity back into organizations. Yeah.
And that's really creating the culture, or having a strong culture. So it's not just about following the processes are there, but they fit within a framework of doing what fits within the values of the organization, or whatever that organization may be. And that's really interesting from again, in yachting, we often see the headlines of the negative side of yachting. What we don't see is the number of jobs that even a single yacht creates through its build, through its its life of being serviced, the crew that are on it, the people who provision it, the tenders, the restaurants where the guests go. All of that would not be possible without those yachts. It has a massive, or can have a massive, positive flow. And I think that's something the industry is really looking at, and how it measures that going forward, along with certainly the other side, that's the environmental cost. And these aren't environmentally friendly assets currently, but I think there'll be a move as we see new generations of wealth come through to look at how that can be made more sustainable. But that's a big challenge for the industry.
Yeah, I'm sure that is an absolute challenge. And of course, I think connecting the E with the S with the G is when you see organizations that are truly working hard to make the interconnection between those three, that's when I think organizations that are truly going to lead in 5 or 10 years time. Those that are, and I don't like the expression, but those that are ticking the box of the E, we're doing things environmentally friendly, but we're not really thinking about our impact on society. We're not really thinking about how we're governing ourselves and our people. Well, that's not sustainable. But I think, we're coming across them in CoSteer, and of course we have the capacity to measure them and to say, well, we can actually begin to quantify how well you're doing this. Then of course it becomes real life almost, doesn't it? You can see these things in colors and numbers on a screen, and okay, they don't tell you the whole story, but at least they give you something to work off and to work with. And I think this is what we're doing, and hoping to influence society, organizations, and the well-being of people in those organizations for the future.
Fantastic. And so CoSteer, you're through a first round of investment. You're building the technology and working obviously with organizations at the moment. It's a cloud-based model. I think your accounting is probably also cloud, just because you wouldn't be able to keep on top of your numbers if it wasn't, with all the moving around that you're doing. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, obviously it's a cloud-based piece of technology. We work in partnership with organizations in Guernsey who support us, but also obviously we're looking here in India as well. Essentially, we provide the services to clients direct, but our main sort of fee source income that we're looking at through our business development at the moment is what we call licensed partners. So these are organizations that obviously have their own clients that they want to support and service. And we obviously have a piece of technology which can help those partners, those essentially business or management consultants, or however you want to phrase yourselves. You will be wanting to support your clients in the best way possible that's the most cost effective. Well, our piece of technology is incredibly cost effective, mainly because it is
subscription-based model for the end user.
Yep, subscription-based model, over a year based on number of people in your organization. If you think, to bring in one of our infamous audit firms to come and assess and measure and give some indication on your sort of, governance compliance, but also your governance performance, you'd be talking, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds. It's a fraction of that. What we believe far more insight.
That pales into insignificance when you think of some of the costs of regulatory intervention or having to be told to do that through enforcement routes, etc. for regulated firms. But it's a very cost effective way of measuring the health of your organization and the health of your people ultimately.
Absolutely, and I think this is the driver for many fintech models, isn't it? It's creating a more cost-effective way of doing something, not to reduce, the need for human involvement. Not to say that suddenly companies need to, lay off staff. In fact, the opposite. What we're trying to encourage is a more flexible approach to employing people. And that there are ways of doing that, and we can begin to support organizations in the measurement of how they can do that, changing their culture. So actually organizations end up employing more people, but just in a way that suits those people, suits those humans more. So we have seen this in some of the clients that we've worked with. So absolutely, yeah, cost-effective fintech approach to measuring what was previously thought unmeasurable.
Great. I'm just looking at the time. It's been a fantastic session, pretty interesting, very different for, I think, maritime, but something to really think about for how yacht management firms and how even at a single yacht level, how people potentially measure their culture on board and look to improve the well-being of their employees and ultimately this is the compliance, safety and the culture on board, and hopefully that helps with, as an accountant, from the costs and measuring that, because there's that cost of staff turnover and there's extra costs if you don't have a happy crew. I'm pretty sure that will reflect in how much it's costing to run a vessel. So Perrin, thank you very much for coming on the show today. You've been watching Talking Sense. I'm Alistair Milroy. Perrin and CoSteer's information will be shared when the show goes live, along with mine. If you have any questions for either Perrin or myself, then we'd be delighted to take them. So thank you very much, and see you next week.